Have you heard the stories that mountains whisper when darkness falls? Have you heard the tales that communities bury deeper than their dead? There are secrets hidden in the hollows of Appalachia, truths that the earth itself tried to swallow. And tonight, I'm going to tell you one of them. The wind remembers what people choose to forget. It howls through the ancient pines of Appalachia, carrying voices that were silenced long ago, whispers that refuse to die, deep in a forgotten hollow where the mountains press close and the fog never fully lifts. There is a story that the earth itself tried to bury, a story of innocence condemned, of love defeated by fear, and of a community that chose darkness over light. This is not a tale of monsters born from shadow. This is something far more terrifying. This is a story of the monsters we become when we let fear guide our hands. In the depths of winter, when the world turns cruel and unforgiving, a small log cabin clung to the mountainside like a prayer barely whispered. Inside, beneath a roof patched with desperation and hope, a young mother labored in agony. The fire burned low, casting shadows that seemed alive, watching, waiting to witness what was about to enter the world. The midwife had delivered hundreds of children in these mountains. Her hands were steady, her experience vast, but on this night, those steady hands began to tremble. What emerged from the mother's body defied everything she understood about birth, about life, about God's plan. 2 children joined at the skull, their tiny foreheads fused so completely they appeared as one being, with 3 faces turning in the firelight. The room fell into a silence, deeper than death itself. The father dropped his axe. It clattered against the floor, with a sound that echoed like judgment. The newborns gasped for air, their cries rising and falling in unnatural harmony. One mouth wailed while the other remained silent. Then both voices joined together, creating a sound that froze the blood of everyone present. It was not the joyful cry of new life. It was something else entirely, something that awakened ancient fears buried in the human heart. The midwife crossed herself, though she had never been particularly religious. The father's face drained of color, his hands shaking not with joy, but with a horror that hollowed him from within. Outside those walls, the night itself seemed to lean closer, listening. This was North Carolina in the 1870s, a world away from the medical understanding and compassion we claim today. These were mountains carved by stubborn families who measured their worth in acres of land, and children strong enough to survive the brutal seasons. Life was a constant negotiation with death, and the earth demanded payment in blood and suffering. Isolation wasn't merely geography, it was a way of existing. Roads vanished into mud each spring and froze solid each winter. The nearest town might as well have been on another continent. Families survived with what they could grow, gather, or pray into existence. Herbs from the forest for fever, pine resin for wounds, prayer for everything else. But in this isolated world, beneath the hymns and communal survival, lived something darker, a sharp edge of suspicion that cut deep. Anything that strayed from the expected was treated with fear. A harvest too abundant might be the work of pride, calling down divine punishment. A child slow to speak might be touched by spirits. And deformity was not discussed in the language of medicine, but in the vocabulary of sin. The old superstitions that settlers had carried from Scotland and Ireland clung to these mountains like fog, tales of changelings left by fairies, witches who cursed families through the womb, divine punishment marked upon innocent flesh. The children born that night walked straight into the heart of these ancient fears. The family at the center of our story had never been wealthy. Their cabin was modest, their land unforgiving. The father worked with calloused hands and little else. The mother bore children and burdens with equal silence. They were unremarkable people, and that should have been their shield against tragedy. But when the mother's belly swelled larger than any pregnancy the neighbors remembered, tongues began to wag, old women shook their heads and muttered dark predictions. Men turned their eyes away in discomfort. The local preacher began using his pulpit to warn against hidden sins that drew God's wrath. Though he never named the family directly, every eye in the congregation turned toward their empty pew. A birth was expected, and with it, a reckoning. When the children finally came, when their fused skulls turned whispers into visible proof, the community's reaction was swift and merciless. These infants were not seen as a medical anomaly requiring care and compassion. They were seen as an omen, a warning, a curse that threatened the very fabric of their isolated world. The mother, despite her weakness, despite the fever already creeping through her veins, looked at her children and saw only life, only love. She had prepared for their arrival with all the tenderness a mother's heart could hold. She had sewn tiny garments, sung lullabies to her swollen belly, whispered promises in the darkness. She did not see monsters. She saw her daughters, but the world outside saw something else entirely. The cabin's single window let in only gray light, weak and colorless. Inside, the mother lay among bloodied quilts, her strength fading but her spirit unbroken. She clutched the swaddled bundle to her chest, ignoring the irregular shape beneath the cloth. She felt their warmth, their tiny movements, their fragile breath against her skin. She chose love in the face of a world choosing fear. The father stood by the hearth, silent as stone. He was a man shaped by toil, his back bent from years of coaxing crops from stubborn soil. Words never came easily to him, but now his silence was different. It was a wall built against the terror rising in his chest. When he looked at the bundle his wife held, he did not see children. He saw judgment. He saw the condemning eyes of his neighbors boring through the cabin walls. He saw the preacher's stern face, already crafting sermons about sin-made flesh. The midwife sat in the corner, wringing her hands as though washing them in water only she could see. She wanted to record the birth in her ledger, to give it proper documentation, but her pencil trembled and scratched across the page without forming words. How does one capture monstrosity and innocence in the same sentence? In the hours after the birth, the children's cries did not stop. They leaked through the cracks of the cabin, carrying into the night, traveling down the hollow into the ears of neighbors who lived scattered along the ridge. It was not that the cries were louder than any newborn's wails. It was that they seemed to come from more than one place at once, voices overlapping in disturbing harmony. Within a single day, every household within miles knew the tale, some from their own ears, others from whispers that moved faster than floodwater in spring. Fear became the common language. Men who had never seen the children swore they knew what they looked like. Women who had only heard the faintest cries declared them the sounds of demons. Stories mutated with each telling. What began as two infants with fused skulls became three heads upon one body, a creature that could turn its gaze in multiple directions simultaneously, an omen no household could survive. Old legends resurfaced from the depths of cultural memory, tales of mountain spirits birthing themselves through human women, witches transforming wombs into vessels of punishment. At the churchyard, people spoke in hushed voices of the three-headed child of the hollow, their words always laced with dread. The preacher seized upon the moment. His Sunday sermon thundered through the small wooden church. Scripture transformed into weapons. He spoke of children born as signs of corruption, of bodies twisted not by chance, but by divine justice. His words painted the infants not as souls requiring care, but as evidence of sin too great to ignore. God marks the wicked, he declared, his voice shaking the rafters, and when he does, we are charged to cleanse our homes, lest his wrath consume us all. The congregation sat rigid in their pews, mothers clutching their own children tighter, fathers staring at the ceiling beams as though seeking answers in the wood grain. No one dared speak against the sermon. The preacher had taken what was whispered in kitchens and transformed it into holy law. The father of the children sat at the back of the church, shoulders hunched under an invisible weight, every word pressed upon him like iron. He felt accusatory eyes on him from every direction. His wife had begged him not to attend, but a man could not ignore the preacher's summons, not in a place like this. Outside the pulpit, the preacher's influence stretched further. He spoke privately with the town elders, his voice no longer thundering but coaxing, persuasive. He reminded them of their duty to protect the hollow, of the shame that would descend if outsiders learned what had been born among them. The world will call us ignorant, he said quietly, but God calls us righteous when we defend his order. In the evenings, the preacher's shadow fell across the cabin door. He came not to comfort, but to persuade. Standing at the threshold, he told the father that mercy sometimes required difficult action, that to allow such children to live was to condemn them to ridicule and torment. He called it kindness, though his eyes gleamed with unwavering certainty. The father nodded, his throat too tight for words. Behind him, the mother turned her face away and whispered prayers no one could hear. Then came the doctor, younger than many expected, his coat marked with travel dust, his voice carrying the precise cadence of education. Where the preacher spoke in thunder and divine wrath, this man spoke in measured clinical terms, as though reciting from a medical textbook. He entered the cabin without ceremony. The father stepped aside. The mother tried to hold the bundle closer, but the doctor did not ask permission. He leaned over, adjusted the cloth, and exposed the children's faces to lamplight. His eyes narrowed, not in horror but in calculation. He observed the fused skull, the strange symmetry, the illusion of three heads emerging from one body. Where others gasped or crossed themselves, he only frowned and reached for his notebook. His pencil scratched rapidly across the page. Craniofacial conjunction at frontal bones. He muttered, two distinct brains likely present, Dual cries confirm separate neural function, prognosis, non-viable. To him, the children were not human lives but specimens, rare anomalies, to be recorded and studied. The mother watched with silent fury, her protests too weak to rise above his steady dictation. The midwife clenched her apron in both fists, shocked by detachment so cold it felt like another form of cruelty. Before leaving, the doctor folded his notes and slipped them into his leather case. He told the father plainly that such children could not survive long, that to allow them to linger was to prolong suffering. He spoke of mercy in the language of science, swift resolution, avoidance of deformity, growing into spectacle. He warned that if outsiders discovered the children, they would become objects of ridicule or exploitation. Better, he said, to ensure their passing is quiet and their remains buried deep. When he left, his words remained in the cabin like a curse. The preacher had provided divine justification. The doctor had supplied scientific validation. Between the two authorities, the path forward was nearly sealed. The council met in the back room of the general store, as they always did when matters too heavy for open discussion required judgment. 5 men sat together in the smell of molasses and kerosene: the preacher, the storekeeper, the blacksmith, the miller, the landholder whose acres stretched farthest across the valley. These were not old men, though the town called them elders. Power had aged them faster than time itself. The preacher laid out the matter first, repeating what he had thundered from the pulpit. Then the doctor's letter was read aloud, his neat script declaring the infants non-viable, his words cloaked in medical inevitability. The storekeeper spoke of reputation. Outsiders will turn this into mockery, he said, or worse, curiosity. The hollow will become a circus. The blacksmith muttered about curses spreading through bloodlines, about danger to their own children. If such deformity were allowed to remain, their decision came swiftly. They had done this before, though never with such spectacle. Families with children born, touched, had quietly disappeared in the past. A widow's youngest had been spirited away by night. The rules were unspoken, but well understood. What was too strange, too dangerous, too shameful would not be allowed to grow. The lie that would follow was carefully constructed. The infants had been stillborn. The mother's fever would carry her soon after. A tragedy to explain the family's silence. The father would be pitied, but spared direct blame. Graves would be dug, records would be written, the truth would be buried beneath earth and ink alike. When the meeting ended, the men rose one by one, each nodding with the solemnity of those who believe they act for the greater good. They stepped out into the winter night, their lanterns bobbing through the snow. Behind them remained only the smell of kerosene and the faint echo of their judgment. The snow was falling harder that night, a heavy veil swallowing sound and sight. In a cabin not far down the hollow, a boy of 9 slipped out into the storm. His father had gone to the council meeting. His mother lay sick in bed. The boy was restless, curious, hungry for adventure. He trudged through the drifts until he saw lights moving through the woods where no one should have been. 5 figures advanced slowly, their lamps swinging like will-o-wisps in the darkness. The boy ducked behind a great oak tree, holding his breath as the men drew closer. He recognized them all, his own father among them. They carried something heavy between them, wrapped in burlap, long and narrow like a swaddled child. The boy pressed his mittened hands to his mouth, his heart hammering. The men moved to a clearing where the ground had been prepared with earlier digging. They set the bundle down Carefully, the preacher knelt and muttered words that were not like church prayers. His tone was harsh, almost pleading. The others shifted uneasily, their lantern light flickering against falling snow. Then, as they bent low to cover the bundle with earth, the boy heard something that rooted him to the spot in absolute terror. A cry, thin, muffled, unmistakable, the cry of something alive. Within the burlap, it was not the cry of an animal, not the scream of wind through trees, but the plaintive wail of an infant struggling for breath. The boy's stomach turned to ice. His legs refused to obey his desperate need to run. He could only watch as his father and the others shoveled earth over the bundle. The cries grew weaker, then ceased entirely. The preacher's muttering ended in silence. One by one, the men stood and brushed dirt from their hands. They looked around the clearing, as though expecting to be watched, but the snow kept their secret. Satisfied, they turned back toward the path, their lanterns swinging through the storm. The boy crouched, trembling behind the oak, until they were gone. Then he stumbled home, half frozen, his teeth chattering not from cold, but from horror etched into his soul. That night, fever consumed him. When he babbled to his mother about cries from the earth and lights in the trees, she told him it was only a nightmare. But some dreams hold truths too heavy for adults to acknowledge. For the rest of his life, that boy would carry the sound of muffled cries beneath the soil as a wound no prayer could heal. The snow eventually melted, but the silence did not ease. What the council had buried did not remain still in the minds of the people. Whispers crept through the hollow like thawing streams, twisting and multiplying. Neighbors spoke of strange cries at night, drifting on the wind from the direction of the burial ground. Men swore they heard faint wails carried through the pines. Women whispered that their dogs bristled and whined when passing near that plot, refusing to set paw on the ground. Children scratched crude drawings in the dirt, figures with 3 heads, creatures with too many eyes, staring in every direction. They dared one another to venture close to the cemetery after dusk, to press their ears to the ground and listen. Some came back pale and silent. Others invented wild tales of clawing hands breaking through earth. The story grew monstrous. The 3-headed infants became specters, haunting the hollow. Farmers blamed failed crops on their restless spirits. A stillborn calf was said to bear their curse. A fire that gutted a shed was whispered to be punishment from the 3-headed child. Fear, once focused on flesh and bone, had transformed into legend. The father felt the weight every time he left his cabin. No one accused him directly, yet every glance carried suspicion. His hands trembled when he worked. He could no longer attend church, could not bear the preacher's voice echoing in his head with the knowledge of what had been done. The mother remained in her bed, strength waning. Fever and grief hollowed her eyes. She whispered the names she had chosen, names no record would ever bear. She clutched at empty air, as though reaching for children she still felt nearby. Her silence was not acceptance. It was the silence of a woman crushed by knowing what others had done to her blood. By spring, when snows had thawed and creeks ran high, the rumors reached the county seat. Officials there, uneasy with whispers of unnatural births and disappearances, dispatched a sheriff to investigate. He arrived on horseback, his badge dulled by years of wear. He was not a fool. He knew how mountain folk closed ranks when outsiders probed too deeply, but he had learned to read silences, to measure unease in the eyes of those he questioned. He visited the cabin first. The father spoke of his wife's difficult labor, of stillborn twins buried in the family plot. His voice caught when describing how fever had taken his wife days later. His words did not waver, though his eyes never lifted from the floor. The midwife was summoned next. She presented her ledger, each entry neat and careful. The page for that February, marked with sorrow. Twin girls stillborn, malformed. Mother perished 3 days later. The Lord's will be done. Her handwriting was steady, her tears carefully timed. She spoke of professional discretion, that some details were too cruel to record. At the church, the preacher welcomed the sheriff with booming hospitality. A community supper was prepared. Hymns sung. He spoke freely of tragedies that visited the hollow that winter, gesturing to freshly marked graves. His voice carried conviction. His eyes met the sheriff's without a flicker of doubt. The sheriff visited the burial site himself. The graves were there, mounded and marked with crude wooden crosses. The ground had been disturbed recently, but in thawing spring earth, that could mean anything. He stood a long while listening to wind through pines, but the soil revealed no secrets. When he returned to the county seat, his report was simple. 2 infants lost in birth, 1 mother taken by fever. A tragedy, but nothing uncommon in the mountains. He noted in a single line an unusual reluctance among residents to discuss the matter, but without evidence, he could go no further. The file was closed, placed in a drawer, soon forgotten by all but those who lived with the silence. For the people of the hollow, the sheriff's departure brought relief and warning both. They had passed their test. Outsiders had come and left with nothing. Their story held, their secret remained. But secrets, like graves, have a way of shifting. Inside the cabin walls, silence and sorrow lingered like smoke that refused to clear. The mother, weakened by fever and grief, slipped further each day into shadows. She clutched at quilts, whispering names no one else had heard. At night she woke trembling, reaching for children who were not there. Her lips formed lullabies, but her voice was cracked and hollow. Her body weakened until she could barely rise. The fever returned in waves. By the second spring, she was gone. Her death folded into the official tale of childbirth and infection. The valley mourned her in silence, though their mourning was laced with relief. For the council, her absence removed the last voice that had dared to resist. The father remained hollowed by loss. His hands shook when he worked. He withdrew from the church, never again stepping across its threshold. On Sundays, he sat alone on the porch, staring at the ridge, listening to echoes only he could hear. But the deepest scars marked the surviving children, 3 sons, who had been sent away the night their sisters were buried. They were too young to understand, yet children absorb truth in ways adults cannot admit. The eldest boy began to stutter. Once lively and talkative, he now struggled with every word, as though each syllable carried unbearable weight. The middle child started walking in his sleep. His steps carried him outside to the small cemetery behind the house. More than once his father found him clawing at earth with small hands, dirt packed beneath his nails, his lips murmuring in dreams. When shaken awake, he never remembered. The youngest spoke often to companions no one else could see. He set extra places at table, insisting 2 sisters needed food. He sang lullabies to empty corners. He described them with startling clarity. 2 girls stuck together who cannot go to heaven. His words chilled his father to silence. The hollow watched these boys with wary eyes. Some said they carried their mother's grief. Others whispered of curses passed through blood, but no one dared speak openly. To do so would risk tearing open the grave the council had sealed. Years slipped by, but shadows cast in that winter did not fade. While the hollow chose silence, another record endured. The young doctor returned to his town with more than words. In his study, among shelves of medical texts and jars of preserved specimens, he added notes about the case, carefully stripped of names, but unmistakable in description. Rare craniofacial conjunction, observed in rural North Carolina. 2 crania, fused at frontal bone. Independent crying, confirms dual neural pathways. Prognosis, terminal. To him, it was not tragedy, but discovery. His pen transformed anguish into a neat entry in the annals of abnormality. Decades later, when his belongings were sold after his death, a box was uncovered in his attic. Inside were notebooks brittle with age, and most chilling, a small skull sealed in waxed cloth. The label tied to it read simply, "Craniofacial Specimen, Carolina, 1877. The bone was fragile, but the fusion at the brows was unmistakable. A fracture line marked where sharp force had separated what nature had joined. Medical students who studied the collection argued over its meaning. Some saw evidence of early pathology, others proof of morbid fascination. Few considered that the human story behind the object. For them, it was merely a curiosity to be measured, catalogued, passed around like a relic. The cries that once filled the cabin were nowhere in their notes. The grief of a mother, the trembling of a father, the silence of a valley. None of it survived in those pages, yet the skull did not rest quietly. Over years, rumors spread in medical school halls of a specimen that carried unease with it. Students disliked handling it for long. Some said the fractures whispered of violence. Others said the empty eye sockets, fused in unnatural symmetry, unsettled them most. In the hollow, the council had buried the story. In the world beyond, the doctor had preserved its evidence. Between the two, the children were denied their humanity, turned into either legend or specimen, myth or medical oddity. But bone remembers, ink endures, and sometimes fragments surface when least expected. Time moved on, but stories cling to families like thorns. By the turn of the new century, many men who had carried that burlap bundle were gone, their names etched in stone markers on the ridge. Yet the silence they had sworn to keep did not die with them. One of those who remembered was the boy who had watched from behind the oak. He left the hollow as soon as he was old enough, seeking work in a distant city. Yet the memory of muffled cries beneath soil never loosened its grip. On his deathbed decades later, far from the mountains, he told a nurse what he had seen. Fever blurred his speech, but details were too sharp to be delusion. He described lanterns swaying in snow, the preacher muttering prayers, unlike any heard in church, the sound from the burlap bundle that should not have been alive. The nurse wrote nothing down, assuming his words were fever-born ravings, but the confession remained, carried in whispers through those who heard it secondhand. The Hilton sons bore their own scars. The eldest never outgrew his stutter. The middle child, long into adulthood, woke screaming of digging hands. The youngest spent years in an asylum, his talk of invisible sisters dismissed as madness. Letters discovered later in state archives revealed his obsession with setting 2 plates at every meal, feeding companions no one else could see. Neighbors who lived through that winter carried fragments of memory. An old woman recalled the midwife who never delivered another baby, her hands trembling until her last days. A farmer's widow remembered her husband returning from a lake meeting with dirt on his boots and silence in his eyes. Each fragment seemed small, but together they formed a mosaic of guilt, fear, and complicity. When descendants of the council were pressed, some held firm to denial, calling the tale mountain legend, but others, tired of weight passed down like cursed inheritance, let words slip. They admitted something had been done, though they never named it plainly. One man, his face lined with age, spoke with bitterness. They said it was mercy, but mercy does not cry in the night. The truth emerged, not in one revelation but in scattered testimonies, deathbed confessions, whispered regrets. Each voice, though weak and faltering, added to a chorus confirming what the valley had tried so long to deny. The story of the three-headed twins was no myth spun from superstition. It was history, buried, but not erased. Years later, long after the hollow had quieted and the council's power dissolved into memory, the ground was broken again. Descendants, scholars, and curious locals returned to the ridge where the Hilton graves lay. Records had resurfaced, whispers had swelled into something more demanding, an insistence that truth be faced. The soil was turned. Beneath it, they found not only the mother's remains, but traces that told a story different from official records. Bones too small, fused in ways no natural burial could explain. Fragments bearing the unmistakable signature of the children long denied. For families who gathered, it was both confirmation and condemnation. Truth that had haunted them through rumor now lay open. Some wept openly, others turned away. A minister prayed over the site, his words softer and more humble than thunder once preached from the same pulpit. The children, unnamed in life and hidden in death, were at last given markers, modest stones bearing simple inscription. Daughters loved, remembered. The act did not undo choices made in 1877, but it broke the silence that had bound the community for nearly a century. The hollow, once fractured by fear, began to tell its story with honesty. For the first time, descendants of those who had acted and those who had suffered stood together in recognition of what had been lost. The father never lived to see this day. He had died years earlier in another county. His obituary, making no mention of daughters, erased from history. The sons too had passed, each carrying scars to the grave, but in the reburial, their ghosts seemed present, lingering in heavy air. Witnesses at last to truth no longer denied. What remains of this story is more than bone or rumor. It is a reminder of how communities, when faced with fear, can turn against their own, can twist mercy into cruelty, can call silence protection when it is only guilt. The three-headed twins of North Carolina were not omens, not curses, not monsters. They were children, fragile, innocent, human. Their fate was not sealed by God or nature, but by men who chose fear over compassion. The story closes where it began, in the cold silence of mountains. Only now, the silence carries a lesson. It asks us whether we too would have bowed to fear, whether we too might have let whispers decide what love should have defended. In their brief lives and long shadows, those children ask us still, will we remember, or will we bury truth again beneath comfortable lies? The wind still howls through those ancient pines, carrying voices that refuse to be forgotten. And in that howling, if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of cries that should never have been silenced. Some stories are too important to remain buried, some truths too heavy to forget. This is one of them.